In a small town in northern Pennsylvania, there's a factory that has never left. Not once, not to Mexico, not to China, not to some tax-friendly state 1,000 miles away. For more than 90 years, every single lighter this company has ever sold has been made in the same town where it started. That almost never happens anymore. On this channel, we've told story after story of American manufacturers who moved, merged, went bankrupt, or simply disappeared. This one didn't. This is Zippo. You already know the sound, that distinct metallic click when the lid flips open, and the sharper click when it snaps shut. Filmmakers have used it in more than 2,000 movies, almost always at exactly the right dramatic moment, because audiences instantly recognize what it means. And this isn't really a story about how a company fell apart. It's a story about the one time, against some genuinely brutal odds, an American factory town didn't lose. The story starts with a man who, by most measures, hadn't had much luck yet. George Blaisdell grew up in Bradford, Pennsylvania, working in his father's machine shop starting as a teenager. He kept that business running through World War I, sold it, tried his luck on Wall Street, lost most of what he had, and came home to make a modest living from a handful of local oil wells. He hadn't finished much formal schooling. What he did have was decades of hands-on mechanical experience, a stubborn streak, and, by his late 30s, more than one failed venture already behind him. By the early 1930s, in the middle of the Great Depression, Blaisdell was a man in his late 30s still looking for the one idea that would actually work. He found it on the terrace of a country club.
One evening in 1932, Blaisdell watched a friend fumble with an imported Austrian lighter. It required 2 hands to use. It was thin, easily dented, and frankly kind of ugly. But it worked, even in the wind, thanks to a clever little metal chimney around the flame. Blaisdell asked why his friend bothered with something so clunky. The answer was simple. Well, it works. That was apparently all the inspiration Blaisdell needed. He decided he could keep what actually worked about that awkward little lighter and fix everything else that was wrong with it. He built his own version, a rectangular metal case, a hinged lid that opened and closed with one hand, and that same reliable windproof chimney design underneath. For a name, he borrowed the sound of another fashionable invention of the moment, the zipper. He liked how modern it sounded. Zippo. Production started in 1933 in a room above a garage that cost $10 a month to rent. In that first year, the company built roughly 25,000 lighters. It wasn't an instant sensation. Blaisdell priced the lighter at what felt, at the height of the Depression, like a genuinely bold amount for a small metal object. He was betting that people would pay more once for something that never needed replacing, instead of less over and over for something that did. Every single one came with a promise that still holds today. It works or we fix it free. Blaisdell wasn't just an inventor. He was, above all else, a salesman. In 1937, he launched Zippo's first national ad campaign, built entirely around proving one specific claim, that this lighter could stay lit in wind that would blow out anything else. He called it the fan test, and it became the centerpiece of Zippo advertising for years.
The star of that campaign was a character named Windy, dramatizing the exact moment a howling gust failed to do what it was supposed to do. Picture an electric fan blasting directly at a lit flame, close enough that any ordinary lighter would have flickered out instantly, and the little flame just holding steady behind its metal chimney, completely unbothered. It sounds almost too simple to work as marketing. It worked anyway, for decades. Then World War II arrived, and Zippo's entire business changed almost overnight. During the war, 100% of Zippo's production went to American service members. Soldiers carried them into combat. They personalized them, scratched initials and unit numbers into the metal, passed them between friends as good luck charms. The company picked up a nickname that stuck for the rest of its history, the GI's friend. Those wartime lighters, scratched and dented and carried through places most of their owners never talked about afterward, are among the most valuable pieces in Zippo's entire collector market today, not because they're rare, but because of exactly where they'd been. That single wartime reputation did more for the brand than any advertisement ever could. Zippo came home from the war not just as a product, but as a small, pocket-sized symbol of having made it back at all. The post-war decades were, by almost any measure, Zippo's golden age. Blaisdell, ever the showman, had a 1947 Chrysler converted into a giant rolling replica of the lighter itself and sent it touring around all 48 contiguous states, showing up at parades and events for decades. And then, sometime in the 1970s, it simply vanished. Nobody seems entirely sure what happened to the original Zippo car. It just stopped touring, and the trail goes cold. Hollywood noticed the lighter too, even if the car eventually disappeared. Zippo lighters started appearing in film after film, almost always at a dramatic moment, that distinct metallic flick and click becoming as recognizable on screen as any line of dialogue. By 1962, the company hit a historic peak in production and sales. It felt, for a moment, like Zippo could simply keep doing exactly what it had always done, forever. Then, in 1973, a French company called Bic did something that should have ended Zippo's story completely. They introduced a disposable butane lighter. Cheap, plastic, meant to be thrown away the moment it ran empty. It was, in almost every practical sense, the opposite of everything Zippo had spent 40 years building a reputation around. Zippo's entire identity was built on the opposite idea, a lighter built to last, refilled and repaired instead of replaced. Suddenly, that identity looked less like a strength and more like a liability. Why pay more for something built to last forever when you could pay pennies for something you'd throw away in a few weeks anyway? A lot of consumers answered that question the same way, and Zippo felt it immediately. In 1978, George Blaisdell died. Ownership passed to his daughters, who chose not to run the company themselves, and installed a longtime employee, Robert Gailey, as president instead. He inherited a genuinely difficult situation. Throughout the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, Zippo's annual sales stagnated at around $30 million a year. For a company that had spent decades assuming steady growth was just how things worked, an entire decade of flat sales was a real warning sign.
Think about what a full decade of stagnation actually means inside a company. Whole product lines that don't grow. Whole years of planning meetings where the same disappointing number comes back around. It's not a single dramatic crisis. It's something slower and, in its own way, more corrosive. The quiet fear that the thing that made you successful for 40 years might simply be over. Industry analysts at the time were blunt about the underlying problem. Zippo had built an excellent factory, but it hadn't kept up on the marketing and strategy side of the business. Making a great product, it turned out, wasn't automatically enough anymore. Here's where this story splits off from almost every other one we've told on this channel. Zippo didn't fold, it didn't sell out to a larger competitor, and it didn't quietly move its factory overseas to cut costs and compete with Bic on price. Instead, in the mid-1980s, the company made a very different kind of bet. If Zippo couldn't win a price war against something meant to be thrown away, it would stop trying to fight that war at all. The company leaned hard into exports, aggressively expanding into international markets and into an audience that Bic's disposable lighters, almost by definition, could never have: collectors. A lighter meant to be kept, personalized, and passed down was never going to compete on price with something meant to be discarded. So Zippo leaned all the way into permanence instead: commemorative editions, limited runs, and decades of quietly stamped date codes on the bottom of every lighter. Originally just a quality control measure that turned into a built-in tool for a growing global hobby of collecting them.
Collectors started tracking down specific years, specific finishes, specific commemorative runs, the same way people chase rare coins or vintage cars. Zippo hadn't planned for that hobby to exist. Once it did, the company built an entire strategy around feeding it. It worked. By the late 1980s, exports made up roughly 60% of Zippo's total sales. Japan alone was buying about 1 in every 4 lighters the company made. A product built to be kept forever had found exactly the customers who wanted precisely that. R. Case & Sons, a well-regarded pocket knife maker with deep roots in the same corner of Pennsylvania. Rather than chasing a completely different business far from home, Zippo simply grew sideways into an adjacent craft it could still produce close to Bradford. It was, in its own quiet way, the opposite of the playbook so many companies followed elsewhere. Instead of buying a distant competitor and closing the local plant to cut costs, Zippo bought a neighbor and kept both factories running in roughly the same zip code. 4 years later, the company opened the Zippo and Case Museum, right in town, complete with a live repair clinic where visitors can watch decades-old lighters get fixed for free, exactly like Blaisdell promised back in 1933. In 2012, Zippo built its 500 millionth lighter. 500 million. From a company that, 3 decades earlier, had spent nearly 10 straight years wondering whether it would survive a 5-cent piece of disposable plastic. Put that number next to the origin story for a second. A man with an 8th grade education and a failed stock portfolio started this company in a rented room above somebody else's garage.
90 years later, it's still standing, in the same town, and it's built enough lighters that if you laid them end to end, they'd circle the globe several times over. Today, Zippo is still privately owned by descendants of George Blaisdell. His grandson chairs the company. His great-grandson helps run it. And every single lighter the company makes is still manufactured in Bradford, Pennsylvania, in the same town where a failed stockbroker once looked at somebody else's clumsy lighter and thought, I can build a better version of that. Almost every other company on this channel eventually left the place that made them. Zippo never did. That's not an accident, and it isn't just sentimentality either. Every decision that could have moved production somewhere cheaper, the disposable lighter crisis of the 1970s most of all, was instead answered by doubling down on exactly what made the Bradford factory worth keeping in the first place. Maybe that's the real difference between surviving and disappearing. It's not about being too big to fail or too important to lose. Sometimes it's just about refusing to leave and figuring out one hard decade at a time exactly who still wants what you were building in the first place.